Good morning everyone and welcome to this local review body meeting of the 30th of March 2021. I am Councillor Lewis Simpson, the convener of the local review body, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Councillor Ian James and Councillor Bob Braun, and I'm very grateful to them for volunteering to sit on the committee today. I'm also joined by Mr David Harrison, who's the planning advisor to the LRB, and he is not part of the planning department and has had no previous involvement in any of the applications on the agenda today. I'm also joined by Mr Colin Elliott, who is the legal advisor at the LRB, and Mr Danny Williams from Committee Services. Colleagues, can I ask if there are any declarations of interest by members on any item on the agenda today? I have none.
None from me, convener, and none from me, convener.
Thank you, colleagues. The minutes of the previous meeting, can we note the minute of the last meeting?
Noted. Agreed.
Fine. Before we move to the first item, I'd just like to apologise to anyone watching for the slightly later start. We had a technical difficulty which, thanks to some swift work by Committee Services colleagues, has been resolved. So, can I ask you, Mr Harrison, we'll move to the first item, 4.1, which is a planning application for the erection of 4 dwelling houses on land 60 metres west of 14 Ross Farm Steading along Forgan. Can I ask you, Mr Harrison, to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, convener. Maybe just as a preliminary to that, as part of the meeting in general, just for the benefit of people listening, there were 3 of the items were continued for site visits by members. And just to confirm that the site visits have taken place, albeit separately and individually in accordance with the COVID regulations. So just to move on to the first item, as you say, this is a planning application in detail for the erection of 4 dwelling houses at land 60 metres west of Ross Farm, Steading by Longforgan. The site abuts the recent conversion and development of the former farm steading for housing. The proposed houses would be of a 1.5 storey pitched roof form. Their design could be described as a contemporary interpretation of a traditional dwelling house. The roofs would be clad in natural slate and the walls finished in a white render with stained timber cladding. Now maybe just take you through some photographs now, but we like to have page 35 onwards, which provides you with the location plan, the site plan, drawings of the proposed houses. The general sequence of the photographs will be approaching the site from the north, as you see in the first photograph here, then approaching the site from the western side, then the site as seen from a northern aspect, and then from a southern aspect, and then 1 or 2 photographs of the existing development. You of course will be familiar with this one to some extent from your own site visit. So this is, as I say, approaching the site, looking in a southerly direction, and you can see the openness of the landscape there and the position of the existing development at Ross Farm, and then beside it on the right hand side, as indicated by the red line, the application site as an extension on the western side. So if we move, as it were, down the road from that, the next photograph, this is, as I say, approaching the site from the west now, and as we see the hedge along the roadside frontage there, and then in just, as it were, over the hedge, we see some of the planting which is referred to on that western boundary to the side of the application site, and then beyond that we see some of the roofs and a bit of a gable of the existing development. So from the same sort of position there, moving slightly to the right, in the next photograph, as it were, we're looking over that hedge now. We see the western planting as it projects out into the open field, and then we obviously see beyond that down towards the River Tay. And then moving on from there, swinging slightly to the left of that photograph, we move up the road a little bit, and this is us now, of course, getting closer to both the existing steading development. We have the western planting on the extreme right-hand side of the photograph, and then we have, indicated by the red line, part of the frontage of the application site. So from there we go slightly to the right, and we see again over the hedge towards the planting, and through that planting we see some of the existing development. Moving on from there to the left, as it were, we swing right round just to give you an impression in the opposite direction. This is us now looking in a northerly direction towards Huntly Castle and Llanforgan, and just to give you a feel for the, shall we see, the flat openness of the landscape there before you get to the rising hills. Moving on in the next photograph, swinging round to the right, again stepping up that road a bit further, we're getting more of the frontage of the existing development, identifying the access into the application site, which of course partly serves the existing development as well. And we have the frontage of the application site and the hedge associated with that. Moving on from there and going to the right, we again look over the application site frontage towards the existing development. And then in the next photograph, again swinging to the right, we're looking down, shall we say, the main body of the application site. We've got, of course, the existing development just caught on the left-hand side of the photograph, and similarly the open ground in between, and then on the right-hand side of the photograph, some of the existing planting on the western boundary. So from there, we move into the, shall we say, the adjoining field to the application site, just to give you a feel from that angle. And we have a sequence of photographs from there, swinging round again towards the right in that photograph. In the next photograph, we have the extent of that, shall we say, the boundary between the planting on the western side and the field. And then if we move on from there into the next photograph, we see the frontage of the application site next to the road and say some of the existing development there. So swinging around to the right of that photograph, look across the application site to the existing development. Swing right again to that in the next photograph, we look down again the body of the application site. And then again in the next photograph, we swung all the way around, as it were, and we're catching the western planting. From that position, we then move up the application site, as it were, and this is us towards the southwestern corner, as I say, looking in a westerly direction. So you're just catching the corner of the planting from that position on the western boundary and looking across the open field. And then from there, we're going to swing round again towards the right. The next photograph, we're looking down that western planting. And obviously you can see it becomes slightly thinner as we get towards that southern end. And then swinging round again to the right in the next photograph, looking across the main body of the application site. Swinging around again from that same position in the next photograph, we look across the application site to the development as it stands at the moment. And swinging around to the right again in the next photograph, we take the SUDS and drainage facility that's referred to in the papers on basically on that southern boundary. And then swinging around to the right of that in the next photograph, again from the same position, we see some of the planting on that southern boundary, which I think as everyone recognises is considerably thinner than on the western boundary. And then swinging round to the right of that photograph, we look across from that same position towards the River Tay in that southerly direction. So from there, we move on to the next photograph, and just to give you a little bit more a feel, of course, the SUDS area is out with the actual application site boundary. So that's the southern boundary identified there, where you've got this break between, shall we say, the maintained area and the relatively unmaintained area. And swinging around to the right of that photograph, look across the main body of the site from, say, that southeastern corner. Again, round from in the next photograph, we look up that access road to the SUDS facility, which of course abuts some of the development. So that's the separation between the application site and the existing development. And from there, we as well step up that access road just to give you an impression of some of the existing development. We have the more modern contemporary housing there, and then further in we have the listed farmhouse, which is referred to in the papers. So if we move to the next photograph, again just to give you an indication of the development which is currently opposite the application site and would share the access with it. And then if we move to the next photograph, we see that frontage facing onto the public road. And then if we move to the next photograph, I'll leave you that with a general photograph of the application site. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, the applicant recognises the previous refusals of planning permission for housing on this site by the council officers and the local review body. The existing tree planting beside the western boundary belt, which is subject to an agreement with the landowner, and the roadside hedging on the north is seen as providing well-established enclosure. Additional boundary planting within gardens is also envisaged. The existing housing provides enclosure to the east. It is recognised that planting on the southern boundary is limited. However, this aspect is seen as less important as it is onto the open farmland and is not subject to general public view. Consequently, the existing and proposed planting is considered to provide a landscape framework enabling the proposal to accord with the criteria of the Housing in the Countryside policy and guidance as an extension to a building group and the placemaking policies of the local development plan. The proposal is also viewed as completing the present development. In the broader landscape context, the proposal is seen as reflecting other development in the Carse of Gowrie, where there are groups of houses in the open landscape. The refusal of planning permission is seen as being inconsistent with the granting of consent for similar developments for housing on sites of former farmsteadings, for example at Broadford Farm near Auchterarder and Netherturn Farm near Blackford, both of which are seen as lacking a landscape framework. The site was previously occupied by a large farm building demolished in 2005. The land was last used as a builder's compound in association with the development of the existing houses at Ross Farm. It is not considered to constitute farmland as it has not been cultivated for some 70 years. The reference to prime agricultural land in the Local Development Plan Policy ER5, that is now of course policy number 50 in the new development plan, is a third reason for refusal, and this is disputed. The proposal is seen as removing dereliction and resulting in significant environmental enhancement in relation to the existing housing and the wider landscape. The proposal is seen as according with the criteria for development as a rural brownfield site in terms of the Housing in the Countryside Guidance 2019. That of course has been updated, and the policies of Local Development Plan 2. Access to public transport, including a school bus provision, is seen as adequate. The layout, scale, materials and form of the 4 detached house development is intended to reflect and complement the existing development. This is seen as low density development. In response to representations, the applicant comments that, firstly, there is no evidence that the SUDS and drainage provision is at capacity. Secondly, the applicant has rights of access to these facilities and to the site. And thirdly, amenity impacts and design considerations are subjective. It is considered that a local resident has sought to influence the processing of the application through correspondence which contains inaccuracies. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. The original consent for conversion of the steading to housing was granted in 2005. In 2015, consent was granted for a total of 8 houses, replacing and adding to a number of earlier planning permissions. This application site was the subject of previous in principle and detailed planning applications that have been refused by officers and the local review body. Due to the location of the site within any settlement, due to the location of the site out with any settlement, it falls to be assessed against Local Development Plan Policy RD3, which of course is policy number 17 now, regarding housing in the countryside policy and associated supplementary guidance. This allows for extensions to a building group into definable sites. namely sites formed by existing topography and/or well-established landscape features. While the planting and hedging on the western and northern boundaries are noted, these are not considered to provide sufficient containment within the open landscape to form a definable site for the proposed housing. This view reflects the previous decisions. It is further noted that the hedging and planting are not within the applicant's ownership or control, and are not an extensive, as illustrated on the planning drawings. There is no information on how this planting would be managed or maintained in the future. It is noted that the site lies within an area identified as prime agricultural land. Consequently, development of the site for this proposal is assessed as being contrary to local development policies ER3, that is, of course, is policy 50 now. The proposal is also seen as failing to make a positive contribution to the existing housing development in accordance with local development plan policies PM1A and PM1BC, which are now policies policies 1A and 1BC. This proposal is viewed as constituting an overdevelopment of the overall site, as the present housing is relatively close-knit. In that context, the proposed detached housing is seen as failing to reflect the character, layout and building pattern of the existing building group and the original steading buildings. In addition, the proposal is seen as having a significant detrimental effect on visual amenity and landscape character of the area. Finally, the housing in the countryside policy offers some scope for new housing on rural brownfield land to remove dereliction or to result in significant environmental improvement. While it is accepted that the site formerly contained a farm shed, this was removed some 15 years ago, and the ground is largely vegetated as grassland. As such, the site is not viewed as being derelict in the context of its development, in that its development would remove such dereliction to justify and secure significant environmental improvements. Consequently, the proposal is not assessed as being supported by the brownfield land category of the Housing in the Countryside policy and guidance. And maybe at this point I would make a note that, of course, the Housing in the Countryside guidance has been updated and the assessment of brownfield land is now undertaken on a slightly different basis now. Turning now finally to representations, there are 12 representations that have been submitted, mainly concerning the proposal being contrary to the development plan and Housing and Countryside policy and guidance. Secondly, the lack of additional capacity in the treatment plant and suds facility, and also in relation to the ownership of these facilities and the access road. And thirdly, in relation to the design and visual impact. In this case, there was a request for a site visit, which, as I mentioned, has been undertaken. There is no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Colleagues, are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Can I ask you first, Councillor James?
No, nothing further from me, thanks, Convener.
Right. Councillor Broughton?
No, nothing from me, Convener.
Right. I have one, if I may, just if we can just go back to this, the idea of the definition of a brownfield site. Could we just perhaps be clear? This is quite a long planning history, this site, and has the definition of whether or not it's a brownfield site changed in the times that these since 2005, when the application was first made?
Yes, Convener, as I've noted, I've tried to update you slightly as I went through the description, which was submitted, of course, prior to the change of your local development plan, and also the updating of the Housing in the Countryside guidance, supplementary guidance, that is. I'm wondering whether maybe the easiest thing, rather than me try to tell you what the differences were is maybe just to update you, just for clarity, so we make sure there's consistency and understanding. If I maybe just read you what appears to be the most relevant paragraph of this is category 6 of your supplementary guidance. It reads as follows: many sites which were formerly occupied by buildings have little or no environmental impact and can be left to return to a natural state over time. Even sites where some contamination is present may not require to be remediated if there is no significant risk to human health or the wider environment. This category of the policy is not intended to allow the redevelopment of sites like these, nor is it intended to permit the redevelopment of sites for housing where buildings have simply been allowed to fall into disrepair. This category is intended to allow small-scale housing proposals on cleared sites which have been significantly degraded by a former use or activity, and where the redevelopment of the site for housing is the only means by which it is viable to remediate the site. So in other words, it's recognising there can be remediation without necessarily having development. And maybe a second paragraph, just to be clear on that. In most cases where contamination which requires remediation is present, and we have no information on that in this case, a contaminated land investigation and remediation plan will be required to be submitted as part of any planning application. Detrimental impact on a sensitive landscape will require to be evidenced in a supporting statement to be submitted with any planning application. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, Sir Harrison. Thank you. So we can move to a preliminary decision. So members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor James?
More than happy to proceed with this one, Convener.
Councillor Braun?
Happy to proceed, Convener.
Yes, and I too am happy to proceed. So we'll assess the case and move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor James, having considered the applicant's papers, report of handling, Perth Kinross local development plan, and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Thanks very much, Convener. The site visit was welcomed, to be honest, and I think it was needed and a little bit of an eye-opener. I took the time to walk around the site. I am aware of the history, and I do feel that this is a brownfield site, because it was, as we've been told, had a farm building on it at one point. It was also used as a storage site, if you like, for the other houses next to this development. I'm a little concerned that some of the representations are a little bit NIMBYism. I did take the time to go and view the Suds Pond because I know this was an area of concern. And Convener, I've got to say that it was absolutely dry as a bone, and bearing in mind the weather we have had recently. So I don't have that same concern. The other thing that struck me is the defined boundary. Google Earth is your friend. I always look at Google Earth before I go and do a site visit, so I can, you do get an aerial view and you can see what you're actually looking at. And it's plain to me that this site falls within a defined boundary, with agricultural land either side of it. And I also think that this would be part of an infill, an infill site, form part of the other site, and would actually, being that they're only 1.5 stories as opposed to 2, which the houses are already there, would actually break that sharp surface, so visual amenity I think would actually be enhanced. The precedent's already been set here anyway, but with the development of these houses around by the Steading. So to my mind, convener, I'd be minded to allow this development.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor James. Councillor Braun, may we have your view?
Thank you, convener. Yes, I too had a site visit on my own on the 24th of March last week, and I have to say that my first impression was this is a well developed site. I think it's a very nice site. I think the builders should be commended for the work they've done. It's in a very good location and very well. The conversion is very well done. With regards to this part, yes, certainly there was an old building, an old farm building on it. Although I believe the field is larger than the footprint of the building. But that said, in my opinion, there is a clear boundary to the north. Of the hedging is there. There's a boundary to the west, the trees of the field, and I know at the south there's nothing there as such, but the Suds Basin is there. So in my mind, I think there is a boundary here to work with, and I do feel that the 4 houses proposed would balance the site out overall. The points raised by the residents about rights of access and the Suds, I think the applicant has proved that those they do have rights of access over the road, which is a problem that's been solved. So I am of the opinion to uphold this appeal. I think overall, in this instance. I don't want to set a precedent in any way, but in this instance, I think the 4 houses would fit nicely into the site, and as I say, would balance the whole site with the existing properties that were on the other side of the Steading. And obviously, we'd have the standard conditions put in as we normally have for any new build. The only thing I perhaps might want to ask a bit of a crew on is bearing in mind this field was used for storage of materials during the original conversion, whether there should actually be a contamination report done on the site as a condition. I'm not sure. I'll have to take advice on that. But overall, I'm prepared to uphold the appeal on this one and allow this to go ahead. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Brown. I noted when I visited the site, it's always a benefit, I think, to see sites. That the karst is a very flat area, and this seems to me to be quite a well-defined site, I think. The only difficulty, or a couple of difficulties I had, was I'm disappointed to see that so many of the representations were actually factually incorrect, which doesn't help the case. Whereas the applicant had in fact attempted, unlike some other applicants, to actually answer the questions that we'd put previously, and the further information was very helpful. The difficulty I have with this one is the definition of a brownfield site, because there's no way you could describe this as derelict or needing improvement. Having said that, I think, and it's always a balance with these things, I think on balance I am prepared on this occasion, but on this occasion only perhaps, because you have to take each one on its merits, on this occasion to agree with my colleagues, Councillor, my council colleagues. So I think that's a unanimous decision to uphold. Mr. Elliott, do we need to look at any tidying up required?
One aspect, convener, there's an apparent slight difference between Councillor James and yourself, convener, on the justification for granting the application, and that's as to whether it is or is not brownfield land. Now, my understanding at the moment is you are agreed it is a definable site, and that relates to, as far as I understand, the building group. However, you're not in agreement that it's also brownfield land, and we've also heard the issues as to the housing and countryside policy on it being brownfield land. It needs to be remediated. The only option is to remediate. I obviously prefer that you are in agreement on the reasons, whether it be grant or refusal. So on this occasion, convener, what I have is that you are content to grant, and I should say, to clarify, it would be grant subject to suitable conditions and formalities and possible legal agreement, because there are, I think, contributions due. And in terms of the justification, what I've heard from you so far, you're in agreement that it is, it is a definable site and therefore building group. but I don't yet believe you're in agreement on brownfield land. And I'm particularly looking at Councillor James. Are you prepared to leave that aside so that it's only building group?
In the interest of making the right decision, then yes, of course, I'll leave that aside and agree with the convener.
Okay, thank you. There was also a reference by Councillor Braun to conditions. So, convener, I'm content in the sense of it's a unanimous decision to grant subject suitable conditions, informatives and possible legal agreement on the basis that it accords with the LDP2 and the Housing Countryside Policy and the being building group and a well-defined site. But I'd like to turn over to Mr. Harrison in terms of conditions that might be appropriate.
Thank you. The first thing is I pick up is, as you say, there's contributions in relation to transport infrastructure and also affordable housing due in the event of planning permission being granted here. And that would, of course, be prior to the decision notice being issued. I think Councillor Braun, I think it was, touched on the question of land contamination. I've certainly got a note here to say that if you were minded to grant consent, further contamination land investigation and any possible remedial measures which might result from that should really be a condition. Excuse me. Also, there seem to be maybe, as it were, belt and braces approach, considering there has been comment about the issue of foul drainage and surface water treatment. Then it may be advisable to have clarity in that via condition. And also, I noticed that SEPA talked about wanting confirmation about the finished floor levels in relation to possible flooding as well. So again, confirmation about that maybe should also be covered by a condition.
So, Mr. Elliott, do you have everything that you require?
Yes, if members are content with that, then it's granted on that basis, and of course conditions will be added to the decision notice in due course. It appears to answer Councillor Braun's question. There could be a condition on contaminated land.
Fine, thank you for that. Thank you.
So that's item 4.1 complete. So we can now move on to item 4.2, which is a review of conditions 3, 4, 5 and 7 to a planning consent for erection of a dwelling house, garage and retaining wall in Newton Terrace, Blairgowrie. May I ask you, Mr. Harrison, introduce this application for review?
Thank you, convener. I beg your pardon. This is a detailed planning application for the erection of a dwelling house, garage and retaining wall in part retrospective on the former council offices Newton Terrace, Blairgowrie. The applicant's house and its neighbour have been erected and are now occupied. The review contests the requirements of planning conditions 3, 4, 5 and 7 of the planning permission. This two-storey house, along with its neighbour, has been erected on the site of the former council offices. This development has involved the significant ground re-engineering, resulting in a substantial difference in levels between the two properties and the erection of a substantial retaining wall. And I appreciate you visited the site, but I'll maybe just take you through the photographs just to refresh your memory. You might like to have page 225 and 226, providing you with a location plan and site plan. Plans of the proposed houses and the retaining wall are also available, and that's in page 245 onwards. So I say this is us, first of all, standing in Newton Terrace, looking up towards the two houses. And so if we move from there up the road slightly in the next photograph, just get a little bit closer and it gives you more of the detail of the retaining wall that we've touched on there, and gives you an impression of the difference in levels between, as it were, the upper level where you see the garage building on the left hand side of the photograph, the slope down to the houses from there, and of course the drop down to the lower level where we see the cars parked. So if we move up the road a little bit, from there, again, looking from the public road in Newton Terrace down, and we see the two properties, and again, and gives you an indication of the difference in levels between the two, with the higher level car parking associated with the Horsa and the lower level parking associated with the neighbour's property. And also, I maybe just draw to your attention at this time, as we look at the gable of Horsa, where you can see the window on that lounge facing towards the neighbour's property, which we'll see in more detail later on. But also, as we look past the gable towards the church steeple, as I understand it there, you'll see the glazing of the balcony, which is elevated in relation to the other property as well. So from there, as we move on to the next photograph, we're now looking at where the difference in levels takes place between the two properties. Situation may have changed a little bit since this photograph. I don't know whether the fence has been erected or not, but obviously you can see it was in the process of being erected there. And then if we swing in the next photograph around, we step back and we're just catching the corner of the garage I mentioned earlier on the left-hand side, looking across the upper level of the parking area of Horsa towards the neighbour's property, and you can see how the ground drops away there. And then if we move into the next photograph, this is now standing, as it were, at the upper level within that parking area, looking down towards the bedroom window, which is referred to, and also you can see, as it were, the edge of the retaining wall there. So if we move to the next photograph, again, we see we're looking across the parking area of Horsa, and then if we swing round to the right of that, we're looking from the entrance, as it were, into Horsa towards that side elevation of the adjoining property. And as you can see, there's a side entry or exit, and also we see the double lounge windows on that side of the adjoining property. And if we move from there in the next photograph, we move, as it were, down the level, looking from that lower level of the garden of Horsa towards the neighbouring property, and as I said before, the side entrance and the lounge windows. We swing round to the left in that photograph and step back a little bit. Again, this is from within Horsa's garden ground, looking towards the side and rear elevation of the adjoining property. And as you can see, there is a balcony on the neighbour's property as well, but this gives you the impression of the corner of the building there. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, and slightly further up, we say look towards the balcony on the neighbour's property and the lounge window. And then if we swing round to the right again, on that sort of position, again, we're looking at the boundary between the two properties. I haven't marked the exact, shall we say, line of the boundary, which I normally do on a planning application. There seemed to be some slight uncertainty exactly whether or not that was the retaining wall, the line of the fence you see here, or for even that matter, the line of the additional lower level wall within the property, or would appear to be within the property of the neighbour's property. So from there, if we swing round again to the right, you can see the difference in levels between the lower level of Horsa and the parking area we saw in earlier photographs, with the car parked in it there in the garage. Swinging round again to the right of that photograph, we see the gable of Horsa, and in particular the window inserted in the, shall we say, timber panelling strip on that gable, which is one of the considerations you have today. So that's the lounge window, and again, if we swing round from that lower level again, we see the balcony as seen from the lower level. And as you can see, it's got approximately metre high glazed panelling, 4 panels there, which are opaque, but the concern is that it doesn't, shall we say, reflect the 1.8 metre high screen panelling referred to on the approved plans. So from there we move on and up onto that balcony. So that's us now standing in the balcony of Horsa, looking down towards the adjoining property. And there you can see the entrance, the lounge windows and the other bedroom window. So from there, if we swing to the left, again from that elevated position, we look across the garden ground and the associated balcony and the neighbour's property. Swinging round to the left of that photograph again, from that upper level. In the next photograph, we're looking across the Gowrie itself, or part of Blair Gowrie. And if we swing round to the left of that photograph again, we're looking down onto the, shall we say, the roofs of the adjoining bungalows and the wider town as well. So swinging round to the right of that photograph, we now move into the property, and this is taken from the lounge, looking from Horsa through the lounge window to the side elevation of the adjoining neighbour's house. So from there, we move on. Altogether, in the next photograph, we step into the neighbour's property. So this is the neighbouring wall as seen from Killarney. This parking area, and there are a number of photographs there. So this is the most elevated part of the wall. We swing to the right of that photograph, still at the same level, but it shows you the relationship between the two properties. And then if we move up from there, we now are looking right down the full length, as it were, of the retaining wall. And as you can see, you've got a retaining wall, then a retaining, shall we say, bed as well. And exactly where the boundary falls here is a little uncertain, because as you can maybe pick out, at the end of the retaining wall, there is also a fence. Now we turn around and look in the opposite direction in the next photograph, or down a little bit first. This is just to show you there are weep holes at the base of the retaining wall. Just to give you a detail of that, and also the wall, of course, that's beside it. And moving on to the next photograph from there, we turn around and look back up. This is us now looking towards Newton Terrace, and you can see there's as it were, a lower level bed and then an upper level slope within the neighbour's property. And then, of course, we have the retaining wall on the right-hand side. So from there, from that north end, we turn around and go to the south end. And as you can see, there's a number of possible lines of the boundary between the properties at this point. If we move on from there, in the next photograph, just to give you an indication of what's the, shall we say, the view from the position of the bedroom window in the neighbour's property towards the lounge window of the Horsa, and then swing around to the right of that, from that same position next to the bedroom window, looking back towards the Horsa balcony. And from there, if we move up a little bit in the next photograph, this is, as it were, effectively from the lounge windows of the neighbour's property, looking to both the lounge of the Horsa property, and also you're just picking up the glazing on the balcony of Horsa 2. And swinging round to the right of that in the next photograph slightly, again from that same position, this is the relationship between the balcony and the lounge window. So if we can move on from that photograph, I'll just leave you with that general photograph showing the relationship between the two properties there. Turning in summary to the applicant's case, any planning conditions need to be necessary, relevant to planning, relevant to the development, enforceable, precise and reasonable in all aspects. In this case, these conditions have been imposed to protect the residential amenity of the adjoining house to the south. They required the blocking up of the lounge window, installation of a 1.8 metre high opaque glazing screen on the balcony, planting of a boundary hedge, and the provision of a retaining structure in different materials. The site lies within the residential streets of Blair Gowrie Conservation Area. It extends to some 0.125 hectares and is of a similar plot size to its neighbours. Turning first in relation to condition 3, the lounge window is at first floor level and some 9 metres from the boundary. As such, it complies with the Council's standards for maintaining privacy between properties. There are no direct opposing windows. The privacy of the adjoining house is already compromised by views in from the public street. This condition is not considered to be either necessary or reasonable. Turning to condition 4, the southwest side of the balcony is 9 metres or more from the boundary of its neighbour. The condition is also seen as unnecessary and unreasonable. Turning to condition 5, the requirement to plant a hedge on top of the retaining wall is expected to compromise the integrity of the wall. It is not necessary, as the privacy of the neighbour's property is already compromised by being overlooked from the public street. Regarding condition 7, the proposed white dash render is seen as appropriate as this reflects the walls of the houses. The neighbour has declined access to undertake this work. The requirement on the neighbour's property to plant a hedge on this boundary will screen the wall. Therefore, the condition is seen as unnecessary. In conclusion, conditions 3, 4 and 7 are considered to fail to meet the tests for planning conditions, as they are unnecessary to maintaining residential amenity. A revised form of condition 5, which does not affect the integrity of the existing retaining wall, would be acceptable. Turning now to the Officer's Report of Handling, of course this is the report in relation to the original proposal. The redevelopment of the former council office site has been the subject of a number of planning applications. This application is retrospective, in part, as the works deviated from the approved development on a number of respects, notably in relation to the changes in ground levels and the erection of a retaining wall, which did not gain planning permission as part of the original approval. This application was concerned with the prospective impact of the appearance, height, scale, massing and material finishes and colours involved in these additional works on the residential amenity of the wider conservation area. The minor changes to the design of the house and garage were seen as being in accord with the local development plan. The retaining wall is some 3 metres at its highest point, tapering down to the east. The difference in levels between the parking areas of the two plots is some 4 metres. Due to the height of the wall, the intention to finish this in a white render is seen as oppressive for the adjoining household. As the wall is set at a lower level, the impact from the public road is seen as relatively limited. In conclusion, it is considered that a more sympathetic material is needed to break up the visual impact of the wall to make this aspect of the development acceptable in relation to residential amenity, and to a limited extent the character and appearance of the conservation area. The retaining wall is close to the ground floor bedroom window of the adjoining house. This raises the prospect of potential loss of daylight and overshadowing. The degree of overshadowing has been assessed on the basis of the Council's placemaking guidance. It is anticipated that the retaining wall will limit available daylight to this north-facing window. However, the bedroom is served by a second west-facing window which will receive sunlight. The north-facing window was not seen as the main source of light, especially taking account of the need to provide a hedge on the boundary to address potential overlooking concerns. Consequently, the retaining wall was assessed as being acceptable overall. Regarding overlooking, there is scope for overlooking from the applicant's parking area down into the neighbour's property. This led to a condition requiring the planting of a screen hedge. In addition, following discussion with the agent, the plans were revised to remove the south-facing window on the lounge and to install a 1.8 metre high opaque glazed screen to overcome prospective concerns regarding overlooking from the balcony area. These aspects of the revision have been confirmed through the planning conditions as well as appearing on the approved plans. The neighbour has drawn attention to surface water discharging from the applicant's parking area down into his property. Consequently, a condition requiring the provision of a surface water drainage system has been added to the planning permission. In this case, there was one representation, mainly concerning the impact on the residential amenity from loss of daylight, visual amenity, overlooking, and the impact on the character of the conservation area, site levels and surface water drainage. In this case, there was a request for a site visit, and that of course has been undertaken. There was no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Are there any questions for officers in the application for review? Councillor Braun.
Yes, Convener. Just a couple of questions sort of clarifying really for Mr. Harrison. We can work on the picture we've got in front of us actually. If you go to the very lower corner of the wall, it looks like there's white rendering on that front anyway, I think it was. So that would just be spreading up this wall. Is that the idea?
First of all, we were talking about the retaining wall?
The retaining wall, yeah, sorry, the retaining wall. If you look at the lower corner on the picture, there's and we had previous pictures of showing a white rendering on that. I presume that the idea is that he wants to spread that up that wall completely. Is that the idea? That would be the type of finish we're looking at. Yes,
as you say, one of the earlier photographs, I think one looking towards the north end of the wall. Sorry.
That's what. There we are. Just one. That's it. That's it. So that's the sort of finish we're looking at. The whole, the full length of the wall. Is that the idea?
Well, yes. That. Sorry about this. The render you're seeing in the wall there, that's of course within the property of Horsa.
That's correct. Yep. Yeah. I understand that. Yep.
But there is also, if we were able to move back to an earlier photograph. Sorry. The other direction. Again, that one. Yes. There is, of course, white render on the neighbour's retaining wall between the lower level of its parking and the upper level of Newton Terrace.
Right, but that's the finish with that they want to put on that wall. Is that the idea?
Yeah, assuming that's the render they're intending to match it in. Yes. Okay. So there are two retaining walls with some white render on at the moment. Yes.
That's right. I'm with you. And the other question was this planter that we can see in front here. Could hedges, bushes, plants be planting that, or is it just solid gravel or whatever? Are plants able to grow in it? Is what I'm trying to say, I suppose.
I'm not. It seems possible to plant in it. I think it's probably the material is fairly mixed. I suspect it's material that's been, shall we say, salvaged from the development and may be disturbed and have other material amongst it. But there was a photograph, if you can go back again a little further in the other direction, I'm afraid. That photograph gives you maybe a little bit more of an indication of the nature of the material in it. Some things seem to have colonized it a little bit, but it seems to be slightly mixed.
Right. Okay, fine. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Braun. Any questions from you, Councillor James?
Nothing further for me, thanks, Convener.
Right. I don't have any questions on this one, Mr. Harrison. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Braun.
Happy to proceed as we are.
Councillor James.
Likewise, Convener.
And I too am happy to proceed. So we'll assess the case and move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Braun, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Convener, could I, sorry, Colin Elliott, your legal advisor, could I come in here?
Yes.
There is an alternative way of doing this compared to what you normally do. Normally, one of you speaks on all matters and then you go on to the next. But I'm conscious there are 4 conditions that you need, that are under scrutiny and you need to make a decision on. The alternative way of dealing with it is that you debate each individual condition in turn. So all three of you speak on condition 3, and then you move on to all three of you speaking on condition 4. So rather than one person dealing with all 4 conditions, you do it the other way around. You do all three of you speaking each condition as we go along. If that would be satisfactory, it'd be easier for me, frankly, if we did it that way.
I think it'd be easier for me as well, Michelle. Yes, I think that's the way to do it. I think we'd all prefer that suggestion. So I think I take it, Councillor James, you're happy with that?
Agree with that. I think it's a good idea.
Totally agree with that. Makes sense.
Yeah. So to be clear, then we're dealing first of all with condition 3, Councillor Braun. So if you want to start us off, and we'll do this one first.
Fine. Okay. Thank you, convener. Yes, I think that's a good idea to do it this way. Obviously, I did a site visit myself on the 23rd of March. Had a look over the site as best I could from the road angles. My opinion is obviously that any way you look at it, Kinari, I think that's how you pronounce it, is going to be overlooked in one way or another from Horster. With regards to this condition, the window, I think if you took the window away, the house, in my opinion, wouldn't look right. My thoughts are that given that the lower half of the window is already seems to be of some form of opaque glass, my first thoughts was, as a compromise, would be to see the whole of the window in some form of opaque glass, a light opaque glass, if that's possible, to allow the window to remain. So that would be my first thought on this one. Condition 3 is that the condition be revised to an opaque glass in place of plain glass, and perhaps I can see how my colleagues think about that at this stage.
Councillor James.
I can see where Councillor Braun's coming from. However, that's a living room, and I'm not so sure opaque glass would have any benefit in a living room. I was looking at the slides that Mr. Harrison gave us, and having done a site visit, I'm conscious of the distance between the two properties, and to be able to physically look into the next door neighbour's property, I'm pretty sure you'd have to stand with your nose pressed against that window, and probably binoculars to get a decent view. I know that the original plans were for to continue what we saw in the photograph there just now, the dark grey cladding sort of thing. But I think if it was to revert to that, it would actually make that living room quite dark. So I can probably see why they wish that condition to be removed. The fact that Councillor Braun has already brought up that half of that window is covered anyway, I'm tempted to let this one go and let them keep the window. Thanks, convener.
Thank you, Councillor James. My colleagues is that I'm always uncomfortable with retrospective applications because there's a better way to go about these things. We're not here to give planning advice, I know, but there's a better way to go about this than to go ahead and do it and then apply retrospectively. My concern about opaque glass is that it's not permanent, whereas stopping up the window is permanent. And I'm afraid I couldn't go with the opaque glass condition suggested by my colleagues, simply because it cannot necessarily be enforced in the years to come. So I think, Mr. Elliott, we've got a 2 to 1 here, I think.
Just to clarify, convener, you've said you wouldn't go with the opaque glass. Does that mean that you are wish the condition to remain in situ, so that the window has to be blocked up? I'm not clear. Yes,
that would be my view. Whether it should be blocked up in white render is academic, because I'm in the minority position as far as I can tell.
Yeah, so therefore, thank you, convener. So it's a majority decision. However, the ones in the majority are not quite in agreement. Councillor James is content to remove the condition in its entirety. Councillor Braun has, how shall we say, postulated that it goes to opaque glass, but you haven't entirely concluded. And of course, on this occasion, you do need to come to an agreement by majority as to what it's going to be. You can't have a difference. So I think probably we're best to turn to Councillor Braun at this stage.
Okay, fine, Mr. Elliott. As I say, my concern was that the window opening should not be blocked up, and that was the thing, because I think it would make the house look unbalanced in some way. It just wouldn't look right. So I'm happy to concur with Councillor James that you know, we stick to it as it is. Half the window is as it is already is opaque, and the top half plain glass. And I think there is limited overlooking anyway. You've got to stand there looking out the window. So I'm happy to concur with Councillor James on this one. Yeah,
well, in practice, of course, the window is as it is, but of course the householder could change it later on. So essentially what you're agreeing is removal of the condition, and there will be a window aperture there.
Correct.
Yeah. Yes. So by majority, remove condition 3. So thank you, Convener. I think we're on to condition 4.
Right, on to condition 4. We're getting the hang of this now. Yes. So, Councillor Braun, do you want to consider condition 4 first?
Well, I think yes, condition 4. I think the balcony is the most problematic thing of all, and the way it's designed overlooks. So I to some extent, I'm agreeing with condition 4. I think there needs to be a 1.8 metre high opaque glazing there. I'm of the opinion perhaps half that length could be made 1.8 metre. I think that again we've got to try and find a compromise here for the two parties involved, and I think if we make a 1.8 metre opaque glass along half the southwest side of the balcony, I think that would be sufficient. I think to make it the whole length would again make that balcony look odd, and I think again you've really got to purposely stare into somebody's garden to get around that barrier. So I would suggest the condition changed. Yes, a 1.8 metre high opaque glass finish, but to only half the length, I think would be suffice. I'll see what my colleagues think of that one.
Right. So Councillor James, maybe have your view?
I totally agree with Councillor Braun, but I would add that it's half. It should be 1.8 metres halfway from the house, you know, because it's pointless having it at the end of the balcony. So you know, the halfway along, starting at the French windows, if you like, the house.
So agree with that. So I didn't make that clear. Sorry. Yes, I agree with that.
Right.
Thanks, Convener. I'm in agreement with Councillor Braun.
Thank you. Once again, colleagues, I'm unhappy that this has been done in a retrospective way. There are better ways of going about this. Although I would agree, having visited the site, I'm not sure the overlooking concerns are all that valid, given the sloping nature of the site and the fact that you're quite able to see in from the street and from round the corner and from other neighbouring houses. So although, as I say, I'm not happy that it's been done retrospectively, I think I would concur with Councillor Braun's suggestion of the halfway 1.8. I think, to the avoidance of any doubt, Mr. Elliott, would it be helpful to see either a photograph of the balcony or a plan so that we know exactly what we're proposing?
I think that would be appropriate, Convener, in the sense of there is one there, but I'm also conscious of plans within your papers.
Yeah.
I'm conscious there is a kind of a French window, I think it is, behind that. So you have to be clear, and that's where people would come in and out, and where there's obviously clear prospect of overlooking. I'm conscious that, you know, we have to be careful whether it's exactly half or whether it's covering the lounge windows, and I think better to have Mr. Harrison make comment at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison.
I'm assuming, if I'm interpreting the comments made so far, that what's been described is shall we say, the additional or the heightening of the first two panels as they project from the gable of Horsa out onto the balcony in this elevation. So now we've got 4 panels shown here, and half of that is the first 2 panels. In other words, increasing the height in some way of that Yes, in that area.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. I think if Councillor Braun is happy that is in fact what he's suggesting, it seems to be what I was suggesting. I've just checked my colleagues are happy too.
That was my thoughts when I was thinking about that. Yes, the first 2 panels will be increased to 1.8 meters height.
I think on this occasion we're all in agreement. So so you have everything you need for that one, Mr. Elliott?
Yes, condition 4 is varied rather than removed. And of course, you're talking about an opaque glazing minimum height of 1.8 meters, and it's to be going, essentially what you see in the photographs there, it's the 2 panels, it's halfway along. We will come up with a way of describing that as accurately as possible.
We can rely on you and Mr. Harrison to have that delegated authority. Thank you. So we move now on to condition 5, and again, Councillor Braun, if we can have your view on condition 5 first.
I'm happy to leave condition 5 as it is, to be honest. I think there needs to be some sort of a hedging put in there, so I'll leave that as it is. Not
right. Councillor James.
You're muted, Councillor James.
I'm so sorry. Technology. Making this simple, convener. I agree with Councillor Braun.
Yeah, well, thank you. And once again, I think we are all in agreement. I'm not convinced that it couldn't be done. We're not here to offer horticultural advice either, but I understand there are methods of growing whereby any compromise could be sorted. So I think we leave condition 5 in place, Mr. Elliott. All 3 of us are in agreement with that.
Yes, that's clear, convener.
Happy with that, Mr. Elliott? Right. And now we move on to condition 7. So, Councillor Braun, may we hear your view on condition 7?
Again, on this one, I think, given the other walls already white, have a white dash finish, I see no reason why this whole wall can't be done. I mean, I think the reason behind it is such, it's just not necessary. I think it could be done and will make the whole place look complete. I appreciate that the owners of Kinari are not happy at the moment having that done, but as far as I'm concerned, it would make no difference. I think the rest of the wall is already done in that way. I can't see the problem. And with the planter there in front, there's no reason why the owners can't put plants in there, which would break up the effect of the wall anyway. So again, I think this condition should be removed and replaced by, yes, it should be white dash render as soon as possible.
Councillor James.
Always to be different. I'm not necessarily in agreement with Councillor Braun because I feel this is quite a difficult one to actually enforce because we're talking about render on a wall, which is actually to access it, you're in the neighbouring property, Kinari, and it's Kinari which it affects. If we look in our paperwork, the owner of the horse has actually approached the neighbour and tried to do this. The neighbour's declined. So I'm, it's a rock and a hard place, really. We can say, yes, go ahead and do it, but it's ultimately down to the house owner in Kinari. So I'd be minded to remove this condition, convener.
Right. Thanks so much indeed, Councillor Jones. I maybe should have asked this at the questions, but my concern, once again, like a broken record, there's other ways this could have been resolved, I think. But given that access is denied for doing the white rendering, does it make any difference what we decide, Mr. Elliott? If you can't get access to do it, presumably you can't do it hanging over the top of the wall, so you have to have access to do it.
I don't have the building knowledge, convener, but obviously that's the indication in the papers.
Yeah.
I'll take a step back just to be clear before you give your view. Councillor James, it appeared to be initially you were disagreeing with Councillor Braun, but then you said at the end you would agree to the removal of the condition. So it actually appears you're in agreement that the condition at the moment requires something else, not white dash render. White dash render was on the original plans, as I understand it. That hasn't been approved and it requires something else. And Councillor Braun is in agreement to remove that condition, so it could be white dash render. It goes back to the original plans. And Councillor James, you originally started off the way I understood it, saying, well, not really in agreement, but actually they ended up agreeing to remove the condition. So I want to be clear where you are, first of all. And it's about amenity reasons, as of course the appointed officer was very much talking about the impact of white dash render on the neighbouring house, and felt that it should be conditioned. So I want to maybe take a step back, Convener, and ask Councillor James what his position is. Are you agreeing to white dash render and therefore the removal of the condition, or do you think that condition should remain so it isn't white dash render?
No, I'm confusing even my own self here, Mr. Elliott. So yes, I would agree with Councillor Braun, but my point, I suppose, I was trying to make was it would be very difficult to actually even put the render on anyway, if the neighbour doesn't give you access. But yes, I'm agreeing with Councillor Braun in that respect.
And that takes me neatly on, Convener, to your question.
Yeah.
And all I can say is I'm not familiar with construction techniques. The indications are that they would need access to do the white dash render. And that would be a matter for the neighbours to resolve if that access is required. If you remove the condition, it allows for the possibility of white dash render, and it's then up to them to sort it.
I mean, I am, the more I look at this, my first thought was that the person who's applying the render isn't going to see it, and the person who's going to see it wouldn't be applying it. And it might be better if the finish was to the satisfaction of the resident of Horsa, but of course that's straying into realms of neighbourhood dispute resolution rather than planning. But my concern is that if we condition something that cannot be done, we are not actually resolving the problem, and I think that's where I have an issue with this one, Convener. Because if access can be denied by the owners of Horsa, up to a point, any decision we come to, unless we can condition access must be allowed, it could be academic. And this could be a problem, for an ongoing problem. And what we're trying to do here is to come to resolutions. Whether they suit everyone or not is another matter, but we're trying to come to resolution.
It is a problem, Convener, but I don't think you've got the authority to condition access. That's a private matter between the neighbours as to whether that access is allowed or not. Your remit is to decide what render or finish on the wall, retaining wall, is possible. It's then out with your remit as to how that's actually done. So I'm afraid it's problematic, but you can only go so far. You wouldn't be able to access condition, I think. I appreciate what you're saying. There is an issue as to, can you condition something that cannot be done? There is always that issue, but you're faced with it. What you're faced with actually is the condition's already there, and you're being asked to look at that condition and remove it. And so far you have a majority to remove it, and it is, in terms of the access, that's not resolvable by you, unfortunately. Well,
I think given your comments there, Mr. Elliott, I agree with my colleagues. It is most unfortunate this has come to us, but I think that in our only course of action. So I think you have unanimity again with this one, Mr. Elliott, and the three of us agree.
Okay, Convener, that's clear.
Right, so we've dealt with all these conditions, so that's 4.2 complete. Now we move on to 4.3, which is a planning application for the erection of 3 dwelling houses at land 30 metres southwest of the Leyland House and 50 metres southeast of Tillyochie Farmhouse, Balado. So, Mr. Elliott, Mr. Harrison, I beg your pardon, can I ask you to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, this is an application which has been returned to the LRB, but I'll come to that point a bit later on. First of all, as it says, this is a detailed planning application for the erection of 3 dwelling houses at land southwest of Leland House and 50 metres southeast of Tillyochie Farmhouse, Balado. The application site is in 2 parts. One part comprising plots 1 and 2, and another comprising plot 3. The planning road passes between these areas. There are also a variety of houses and farm buildings in this location, which lies within the countryside. This proposal follows up on an earlier planning permissions for the same development. I'll maybe just take you through the photographs now. And the general sequence of the photograph is, first of all, as we see in this photograph, views from the adjoining public roads, and then the context of plot 3, and then the context of the combined plots, that's plots 1 and 2. So say in the first photograph here, we're looking towards plots 2 and beg your pardon, 1 and 2. I beg your pardon, the photograph's wrong, from the A91. This is looking south towards the pair of plots, I say next to Leland House, which is the white property you see there. And this is, as I say, looking from where the Carnbore side across the intervening farmland. What you'll notice is, of course, the group of farm buildings, which you'll see in later photographs, but also on the right-hand side of the photograph, you see a block of woodland, which again will appear in later photographs, and that's in an adjoining property. So if we move on from there, the next photograph, this is us now approaching the Tilioch itself from the easterly direction. If we move up from there, up the road as it were, I must apologise, plot 1 should be referring to as plot 3. The position of the drainage treatment you'll see on drawings is identified there in the corner of that field. But I should make the general comment that the provision for drainage has, and in fact even the extent of application sites, has changed in the various, shall we say, editions of proposal site plans in various applications that have been submitted. So I just draw your awareness to that. That is not the position of the additional information you've seen in terms of supplementary information showing a drainage facility. That is an earlier position of that facility. So if we move on from there, this is looking across the land adjacent to the plot, and then again a little bit further up the road in the next photograph, we're seeing Tilioch farmhouse, and the red line basically shows the line of access to the plot which lies to the rear. Moving on from there, swinging round to say to the right of that, you see the farm buildings on the opposite side of the road from the farmhouse. And again, swinging to the right of that photograph, we catch the corner of the farm buildings, but a yard and a caravan area on the northern side of the farm buildings. Swinging slightly to the left of that, we have one of the farm buildings, which I think is used for a Christmas tree facility. And then swinging round to the right of that, we see the land adjacent to the access to plot 3. And then swinging round again to the right of that, we see the access in, which runs down the side, beg your pardon, runs down the side of the farmhouse. This access is the access which has been referred to in the certificate of lawfulness, which we'll come to later on, which has been introduced since the last time this matter came to the local review body. Is maybe in this and the next photograph something I should draw to your attention. If you turn to the latter pages of the information which has been submitted, this is supplementary information, and it might be, shall we see, pages 511. If you could go back to the previous photograph, if that's possible. Thank you. If you look at the 4 pages following that, in particular page 515, which is most similar to the present photograph, you'll see that since the site was visited in September of last year, a considerable amount of additional material has been brought to the site in order to form the access and extend the access which is shown in this photograph, which is, shall we say, a historical access into the field adjacent to the farmhouse. But that would provide the means of entry serving the plot to the rear of the farmhouse. And I mention this only just in case you're you were unaware that the additional information you put in shows a change of circumstance in that instance. So if we move to the next photograph, again, that's showing the general line of the access to the plot to the rear. But as you can see, that is at that time part of the field, although I say in these additional papers it is now more formalised as a track. Then swinging to the right of that photograph, we look at the plot to the rear of the farmhouse, and to the right of the photograph again. In the next photograph, we see the rear elevation of Tilliochy farmhouse, the corner of the plot, and then Tilliochy bungalow, which is the adjacent property. Moving on from there, we step back into the public road and we see the farmhouse and the more recently completed garage in the foreground. And then from there, we swing round to the left and we see the farm buildings on the opposite side of the road. And then round to the left again, we see the existing access to Leland House, which of course would be used by the access to the pair of house plots. And then if we swing round to the left again in that photograph, we see looking up to the two house plots. I apologise again for the numbering being incorrect. And then swing round to the right of that, we see the access into the two house plots. And moving up to that access in the next photograph, we now look up the route to the two plots through the field. Swinging round to the left of that, we look across the field itself, and we're just picking up one of the properties on the opposite side of the public road there as well. Then we step into the field itself in the next photograph and follow up that access route. And you're beginning to pick up the remains of the building which is referred to in the papers. So if we move into the next photograph, we're looking across two plots back towards the public road which the first photograph was taken from. And from there, we swing to the left again, we look up across the plots, and we're picking up the remains of the building which is referred to, and there'll be a photograph showing that later. So if we swing round to the left of that photograph again, we look up the remainder of the plot where it divides between that and the rest of the open field and the adjoining property there. We swing to the left of that photograph again. We look across the remainder of the field and we're catching the property on the opposite side of the public road again. So swinging round to the right of that photograph, just get a detail of the ruin. And from there we move up towards the end of the two plots, and these are the trees on that western boundary. So on the eastern side we've got Leland House, and then we've got the gap, and then we've got the woodland. So if we swing round to the right of that, we see the gap, and we're picking up Leland House, and of course the ruin. And then round again to the right of that, we're looking down the rest of that field. We're looking down, of course, to Tilliochy itself and the group of buildings there. And then swinging round to the right of that again from the upper level. Well, I beg your pardon, we jump back to the plot behind the farmhouse. So I've got a photograph of the plot behind the farmhouse there, and the next photograph shows the pair of plots. And if you want to oscillate between the two, if you have questions, we have that option. So just to summarise the applicant's case, planning permission for this proposal was first granted in 2011 and renewed in 2016. This is seen as material planning consideration to the appeal. The proposal was accepted as meeting the Council's rural housing policy previously. Additional landscaping was seen as crucial to contain the plots and limit further expansion opportunities. A Section 75 agreement was also concluded regarding an education contribution and to ensure that drainage provision took account of the need to mitigate phosphorus emissions within the Loch Leven catchment area. This proposal is seen as having been implemented by the sewage treatment plant having been installed as per the approved drawings. A car licence has also been issued by SEPA. As such, it is considered that there is no necessity for this planning application or the appeal. This appeal is submitted to protect the applicant's position. Although Local Development Plan 2 has now been adopted, the planning policies, guidance and the siting criteria concerning housing in the countryside is fundamentally unchanged since 2011. The most recent refusal seems to be based on the different interpretation of these policies and guidance by different planning officers. The two plots have robust definable boundaries to the east, that's Leland House and Garden, and to the west, mature woodland. While the boundaries to the north and the south are open, they are seen as well established by a post and wire fence and reflect a building line of the adjacent properties. It is considered that they would appear as being part of the larger building group when seen from the A91 to the north, or when viewed against the woodland when viewed from the east. As such, they are seen as having no adverse impact on the wider landscape. Regarding the single plot to the rear of the farmhouse, this is seen as having well-defined boundaries to the north, that's Tillyochie Farmhouse, and to the west, that's Tillyochie Bungalow. There is characteristic fencing to the south and east. It is noted that the concerns expressed in relation to landscape impact have not been applied to this plot. Regarding the third reason for refusal, the drainage considerations have previously been dealt with through a legal agreement and, subsequently, a planning condition and SEPA's approval of the car licence. It is noted that SEPA were not consulted and no request for drainage information was made to the applicant, who could have provided more on this aspect prior to the decision. The LRB are invited to undertake a formal consultation with SEPA. There are no technical concerns regarding flooding, access, design or plot sizes. It is accepted that the existing ruin is not worthy of retention or restoration. The proposal for the pair of plots is seen as a more appropriate form and layout for development. In conclusion, the proposed plots, the two plots, are considered to comply with Category 1 building groups and Category 5 conversion or replacement of redundant non-domestic buildings. Regarding the individual plot, it is considered to comply with Category 1 building groups and Policy 19. It is also considered to comply with Policy 39, all landscapes, and Policy 46, the Loch Leven catchment area. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. Planning approval for the three houses was first granted in 2010 and renewed in 2016. This application was not implemented, therefore there is no current planning permission for this development. In noting this planning history, the officer has difficulty in seeing how the proposal would have complied with the Housing and Countryside policy at that time. While acknowledging the planning history, the current application falls to be assessed against the current planning policy and guidance, specifically the relevant categories of Policy 19 of the Local Development Plan and the Housing and the Countryside guidance. Regarding the two plots, the buildings adjacent to the site are viewed as meeting the definition of a building group under Policy 19. However, to be acceptable proposals have to comply with the associated siting criteria. In this case, the part of the field forming the plots only has definable boundaries to the east and the west. The longer boundaries to the north and the south do not have definable boundaries. The northern boundary only has a post and wire fence, and the southern boundary has nothing. Consequently, the proposal is not considered to have sufficient enclosure to form a definable site as an extension to a building group. The site is seen as being highly visible to the surrounding landscape, and the development is viewed as being intrusive within the countryside, notably from the A91, which lies to the north. This site contains a small ruinous stone building that has no roof and is no longer in use. The proposal on this site is for 2 5-bedroom detached houses with large detached garages. The footprint of the new buildings would be well in excess of the ruin to the extent that the proposal is unable to comply with the provisions that allow for the conversion or replacement of non-domestic buildings under Category 5 of Policy 19 and the related supplementary guidance. Regarding the individual plot, to the rear of the farmhouse, the adjacent properties are viewed as meeting the definition of a building group under Policy 19. However, this site is also assessed as failing to comply with the associated siting guidance as an acceptable extension to a building group. This is because the eastern and southern boundaries are only enclosed by fencing, and the land is not therefore seen as forming a definable site within the wider landscape. Regarding drainage, it is noted that the sites lie within the Loch Leven catchment area. No evidence of the required phosphorus mitigation measures have been submitted within the application, therefore SEPA was not consulted. That is of course a matter that's been subject to further information. Access and flooding matters are seen as being capable of being controlled through conditions if planning permission was being granted. It is noted that a contribution to primary education would be required if permission was being granted. Turning to representations, Kinross-Shire Civic Trust have made representations objecting to the proposed development, mainly concerning lack of information in relation to drainage, the proposal being contrary to the Housing and Countryside policy, the housing being out of character with the surrounding area. And I maybe should make a few observations at this point, just by way of an update. The planning application, which was the subject of review, was submitted because the previous 2014 permission was seen as having expired. In submitting the notice of review contesting the Council's decision to refuse this application, the applicant has expressed the opinion that the 2014 permission had been implemented due to some drainage works being undertaken. When the local review body came to consider the case at both its September and its December meetings last year, these assertions were seen as lacking sufficient supporting evidence. There were also uncertainties in relation to the provision and requirements for phosphorus mitigation measures. The applicant has now provided information in support of the assertions, and these are on pages 483 onwards. However, separately, in January, the applicant submitted an application for a certificate of lawfulness, seeking acceptance by the Council that the 2014 permission had been implemented, and the houses could therefore be built under that permission. I understand that a decision has been made recently. In conclusion, despite the submission of the further information following the December LRB meeting, the ongoing process around the certificate of lawfulness continues to be uncertain in terms of what its ultimate status will be in relation to whether or not the 2014 application has been implemented. The implementation or otherwise of that application and permission is, of course, a material planning consideration in the determination of the current proposal by the LRB. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. We would normally move to questions at this point, but I think we'll see what my colleagues say. But I think, given your recent comments, Mr. Harrison, regarding this certificate of lawfulness, I have a concern that we are dealing with this in the correct sequence, and we may not have all the information and all the answers that we require. So I think at this point I would stop and suggest that we defer until such time as we have that. Can I perhaps just check with Councillor James and Councillor Braun that they agree, and then I'll perhaps articulate a bit more of my concerns.
Certainly agree, Convener.
Right, Councillor Braun?
And also I agree as well, Convener.
Well, I think, Mr. Elliott, I think given Mr. Harrison's comments and given the contents of the email which is shown on page 521 of the papers, I think we need to, on this occasion, defer. I know this seems to have gone on for a while, and I would apologise to those involved, but I think we need to get all the information. So I think we need to defer until the outcome of the application for the certificate of lawful use. And we also need to have an opportunity to study development management's response and any decision notice and report of handling. And of course, given that their decisions may give rise to an appeal, I think we need to defer until all that is concluded, which would be at least 3 months for the appeal, but perhaps we just need to defer until such time as all that information is available. And I'll leave the best form of words for that to you, Mr. Elliott, but I think we need to defer this one on that basis, assuming if we could perhaps hear your articulation of what I've just said, and then we'll check that my colleagues agree.
I think there's a couple of parts to it, Convener. First of all, I think it's defer for the outcome of the application for a certificate of lawful use.
Yep.
Use, and maybe in brackets here, including possible appeal, because you are correct, there's an ability to appeal that in about 3 months. Now, you've also mentioned what you might need to establish that, and that would be with development management to provide the, I think I have to say, the report of handling and decision notice.
Yeah.
And we need to account for the appeal, so it would be and any appeal decision notice. And I think, Convener, actually there's a second part of it when I think about it, as to allowing for development management and the applicant to comment on the outcome. Yeah. And its effects on the 14 permission.
Yeah.
So allow them to kind of make a concluding comments as to where this leaves the 14 permission.
Yeah, because I think it's important that we cannot make a determination without all that information. I think. If yes, we can just check that Councillor Braun, are you in agreement with this?
I'm happy with that at the moment, Convener. Yes, I think it's the best route.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor James.
I think that's a sensible way as well, Convener.
Right, so that one then we agree to defer this one until such time as all these other matters are concluded.
Yes, Convener. That concludes the matter on this particular application 4.3. Now, apologies, Convener, but I'd like to go back to 4.2 for very good reasons, for clarity purpose, because something came through my mind that I think it would be beneficial to go back.
No problem.
And it is for clarity purpose, which is the Blair Gowrie application 4.2, and I'm looking at page 222 and the condition 4. Now, to remind members, that was a condition about the glazed privacy screen on the balcony, about being opaque glazing, and you agreed to vary that condition so there'll be a 1.8 metre opaque glazing along from the house halfway along. But what we didn't discuss properly was, what about the rest of the balcony on the side as it extends out to the end? At the moment, that's about a 1.1 metre opaque glazing. Now, I think we should deal with that, because if you don't deal with that, it could go to clear glazing. So I want to ask, is it your intention that the rest of the half extending out to the end remains as 1.1 metre glazing? Because I think we would need to articulate that in the condition.
Well, I think Councillor Braun.
That was my intention, and I think the original condition does say that it shall be retained in perpetuity. So that was the concept, that would be opaque glazing.
Yes. Are you in agreement, Councillor James?
100% convener. Yeah. That's what I thought. You know, we were just going to replace the front part and leave the rest as is.
I think that I agree. It's very important to make this absolutely clear, Mr. Elliott. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
And thank you, Convener.
Right. So we can move on now to item 4.4, which is an application for change of use of vacant land at land 80 metres southwest of Unit C1, Muir Houses, Grange, Errol. So can I ask you, Mr. Elliott, I keep asking you to introduce these things. I'm sorry. Can I ask you, Mr. Harrison, to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, it's a detailed planning application for the change of use of vacant land to commercial vehicle parking and open storage areas, formation of hard standing and vehicle access at land 80 metres southwest of Unit C1, Muir Houses, Grange by Errol. The application site extends to some 1.4 hectares. Access would be from a new entry onto the public road. This proposal is a resubmission of a previous application which was refused. It includes additional information regarding engineering works, site topography, access and arboricultural assessment, compensatory tree planting and tree management proposals, and a landscaping scheme. I'll just take you through the photographs now, but I appreciate you of course have done a site visit in this one, but you might like to have page 575 onwards, providing with the location plan and site plans, and of course there are plans of the landscaping proposals as well. As we see in the first photograph here, the sequence will generally be the existing entrance and frontage, the area of possible tree planting, the application site and the adjacent land uses, and then finally the proposed access position. So I say in this first photograph we have the existing entry at the eastern end of the application site, the blue line indicating it is land within the applicant's ownership, but not within the application site, which is just coming to that point we see with the red line. There are going to be quite a lot of lines on the photographs, not only indicating the application site, but the subdivision within the application site between the mixed use area and the open space areas. So I say if we move on from that photograph, this is a swing round to the right of that photograph. We look back down the frontage of the application site onto the public road, that is. And just to give you an indication, that's the poplars you'll have seen on site, and the wee red dot is basically where the proposed access coming through that strip of poplars would be formed. Moving on to the next photograph, we step into the application site, and as I mentioned, there are two sub areas within the application site. First of all, in the immediate foreground, we have part of the open space area, and then adjacent to that, part of the mixed use area as identified in the local development plan. And beyond that, we have the additional land within the applicant's ownership, with the original access or the existing access identified as well. And then the closest property to the application site, that's Orchard Cottage. So from that position, if we swing to the right, we see the adjoining remains of, I assume, former military buildings on the airfield site, and the extent of the application site. We're looking across the mixed use area, and we're looking to the area to the northeast of the application site, which the applicant has suggested might become a community orchard. And if we move from that position, as it were, up and into that mixed use area, then we have, say, a number of photographs within that, so we say sub-adjoining area to the application site, which is part of the mixed use area. And if we swing round to the right of that, we see some of the trees on that, shall we say, furthest extent of that sub-area within the application site, or so just adjacent to the application site. And if we swing round to the right of that again, we see the remainder of that area and also one of the former military buildings. And we swing round again to the right of that. From within the area, we're looking outward and say looking in a southwesterly direction from that land, looking to the northeast towards the open space area and the mixed use areas as identified in the local plan, and the yellow dotted line showing the shall we say, the separation as it is now between those two areas. The open space area, of course, was an area formerly occupied by wood, which has been. From there, we now step in to the application site. We move in the next photograph, hopefully, and we have a number of photographs swinging across the application site. So I'll say this is us looking at the main part of the mixed use area. And then if we swing to the right of that, we look up to the pair of buildings which again will appear in later photographs, and we have the division between the mixed use area and the open space area, which was formerly occupied by trees. We swing round to the right in the next photograph. We look up the boundary between the open space area and the mixed use area, and of course we got the poplar plantation adjacent to the road there. And from there, if we move up from that position, up that boundary, we have the woodland, of course, on the right hand side. This appears to be a surface water drainage manhole. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but that's what it appears to be. And there's another manhole, which we'll see in a later photograph, on the other side of the application site. But that shows the corner of the open space area and begins to identify the soil heap, which I assume is material that's been stripped from this ground prior to the hard standing being formed. Because as you'll see, there's a bit of a difference in levels between the hard standing area dropping down into what is almost like a drainage ditch and then back up into the woodland at that point. So if we move from there up to the corner of the application site, we see the soil heap within the woodland, which is referred to in the papers. And then if we swing round to the left of that, this is to say at the southern corner of the application site, looking north towards the public roadside and the strip of poplars on that roadside. And I say from that corner, if we swing round to the right, we look back down to where we were with the earlier photographs, across the open space area. And then again, if we swing round to the right of that, we catch the pair of buildings which are within the application site. This is on, say, as now looking in the easterly direction, swinging round again to the right of that, where look over the boundary into the adjoining land use. And then from the left of that photograph, we see the adjoining building hard on the boundary. And then from there, again on that same boundary, we move up a little bit. We have a detail of the other possible surface water drainage manhole adjacent to the adjacent building. And from there, if we move on again, we see one of the pair of buildings within the application site. So this is the buildings next to that southern boundary. It's within the mixed use area. So we swing to the right of that photograph. We look across the mixed use area to the open space area beyond, and then beyond that again, we have the row of poplars next to the road, and the general position of the proposed access would come through those poplars. Swinging around to the right of that photograph. Sorry, I think we've missed one photograph, possibly. Yes, we just see that southern boundary and the adjoining land use there. So from there we move on to the last photograph. This is basically the approximate point of the point of access through the poplars onto the public road. So we've basically gone around the whole site. So if we move to the last photograph, I'll just give you that general photograph of the site. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, the refusal of this application immediately after the agent's submission of comments responding to the concerns from the Community Council was completely unexpected. This locality is seen as an area in transition, notably due to the mixed development proposals relating to the former Errol Airfield. Part of the site is identified for mixed use in the Local Development Plan 2, compatible with the existing businesses and residential units. While storage and parking may not be viewed as the most attractive land use, potentially it creates and sustains tens of jobs and involves hundreds of thousands of pounds of expenditure. It is accepted that part of the site, proposed for the development for storage and distribution purposes, is allocated as open space in the current local development plan. This area was previously occupied by woodland, which has been replaced with a hard standing. The applicant was not aware of the open space zoning and was under the impression that they had an historic permission or that they enjoyed permitted development rights under Class 25 for the creation of a hard surface within the curtilage of an industrial building. The applicant accepts that they were mistaken and apologise. They are now seeking to rectify the removal of the woodland through a compensatory woodland strategy and landscaping scheme which, in time, would replace the poplar stand with mixed deciduous species. This is viewed as an enhancement of biodiversity. The poplars are viewed negatively due to their roots causing damage and potential wind-blown damage to buildings and vehicles. As they are mature to over-mature at some 40 years of age, it's considered that they should be replaced. The applicant is open to proposals which being brought forward for the open space area to become a local nature reserve or for a community orchard. This is seen as a material consideration that would justify the departure from the local development plan open space allocation. All activity has currently ceased on site and the landscaping scheme and remedial work could start to be implemented if planning approval is granted. It is envisaged that the excavated soil will be used as part of the landscaping works. It is not accepted that the landscaping strategy will not provide a satisfactory screen, notably from Orchard Cottage. The applicant envisages the site being rented to a storage and distribution company. The prospective tenant, and therefore the details of prospective land use, is unknown. The proposed palisade fencing would eventually be hidden by the proposed planting. Noise and land contamination matters could be addressed through planning conditions. Tree felling is not seen as necessary to provide visibility at the proposed access. It is noted that the applicant will be constructing a footpath to link such a development to Errol as part of his proposals for a new settlement. In conclusion, while it is accepted that the proposal breaches certain policies and the open space allocation, the material considerations identified are considered to justify a departure from those parts of the local development plan. Turning now to the Officer's report of handling in summary, the application concerns the resubmission of the same proposal which was refused. The application site lies within the Erroll Airfield Grange settlement boundary. This settlement is characterised by a mix of housing and employment uses which have been developed and continue to be developed in response to the dereliction resulting from the former wartime airfield land use. Approximately half of the site is zoned as open space, and the other half has a mixed-use zoning. Some 6,600 square metres of woodland that form part of the open space zoning has been felled and laid out as a vehicle hard standing, a development that is contrary to Criteria B of Local Development Plan Policy 14A landscape. In addition, the loss and reduction of the structural landscape buffer is seen as increasing the visibility of the enlarged mixed-use development area as seen from the public road, which runs along the northern boundary, and also from the neighbouring housing. The landscaping strategy submitted with the proposal is not viewed as a remedy to compensate for this loss of screening. As such, the proposal is viewed as being detrimental to the wider open agricultural landscape character identified in the Lowlands and Tayside landscape character assessment. Consequently, the proposal is seen as eroding the distinctiveness, visual integrity and scenic quality of the landscape in a manner that is contrary to Local Development Plan Policy 39. More specifically, the poplar-dominated woodland, which is seen as well suited to the heavy clay growing conditions of the site, is viewed as having considerable longevity beyond the current age of around 40 years. The replacement planting proposed is not expected to provide the same level of screening and amenity value compared to the poplar woodland. The proposal is assessed as being contrary to the Local Development Plan 2 Policy 40A, which seeks to encourage the protection and management of trees of amenity value. The scale and proposed use of the site raises the prospect of being a source of disturbance to nearby houses, for example, due to vehicle movements at unsociable hours. It is considered that this aspect could be addressed by suitably worded planning conditions. From information gained from the investigation of the adjacent land, there is an inherent prospect of the site being contaminated due to the previous use by the military. Such investigations are generally a requirement prior to the development being undertaken. This proposal is retrospective. The proposed access has raised no objections from transport planning, subject to meeting their standards, including visibility displays, which seem likely to require the removal of roadside trees. In conclusion, the proposal is seen as failing to meet a number of local development plan policies, and specifically about half of the application site contravenes the open space land use allocation. In this case, there have been representations from 6 parties and the Erroll Community Council, mainly concerning the unauthorised and retrospective nature of the proposal, the loss of woodland from the open space allocation, the lack of information concerning parking and SUDs, the impact on residential amenity from noise, and the proposal being contrary to Local Development Plan 2 policies 1A, 1B, 7A and 14A. There has been a request for an accompanied site visit. I appreciate there's been an unaccompanied site visit. There is also a request for a hearing, and this is seen by the applicant to enable him to explain why the application is in part retrospective and to discuss the open space zoning considerations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on this application for review? Councillor Braun.
No, Convener. Mr Harrison answered the one question I was going to have in his last few remarks, so I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. Councillor James?
Nothing further from me, thanks, Convener.
No, I mean, I too have no questions. Thank you very much indeed for your comprehensive introduction, Mr. Harrison. And I have to say, a site visit was most interesting and enlightening for this particular application. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor. Or do we require more information? Councillor Braun.
I'm happy to proceed, convener.
Councillor James.
Also happy to proceed.
Right, as am I, colleagues. So we'll assess the case and move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Braun, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Thank you, convener. Yes, I've got all the paperwork in front of me, and I did do a site visit myself on the 24th of March to see the site. As you say, it's quite interesting to see. The question I was going to ask Mr. Harrison was the amount of open space involved here. It seems substantial. He's mentioned it's about 50%. So my thoughts overall, I can understand the reason that's been put forward. It was a mistake and that there was errors made in clearing this land because they thought they had permission to do so. And I accept that in itself, but nonetheless, it is open space and it is policy of the council to maintain open space wherever possible. If this was a small amount, 5–10%, and perhaps we might be prepared to overlook it, but I'm afraid on this occasion, 50% of the land they've cleared is open space, and I think as it is the policy of the council to maintain that, on this occasion I am going to uphold the reasons for refusal as put forward by the planning officer. So I'm rejecting the appeal on this occasion. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Braun. Councillor James, may I have your view?
Yeah, thanks, convener. Like Councillor Braun, I also went down and did a site visit. And also, as somebody that spent a good proportion of his life in the military and in locations like this, I do wonder that had this been under military ownership still, whether we'd be actually having this discussion. To get ahead and do it. I like Councillor Braun. I'm not over keen on the use of open space, but you know, as a business. But by the same token, should we be supporting business, and does that override the loss of open space? It's a very, very difficult one, and I'm minded to stick with the planners. I have a lot of sympathy with the applicant, to be honest, and I worry about what will happen with this site going forward, because it is, to be honest, it's a bit of an eyesore as it is. But I think it is our policy for open space. You know, it is partly in use. So I'm likely to go with my colleague Councillor Braun and reject the appeal.
Thank you very much, Councillors. This is indeed a tricky one, colleagues, because the area is a bit of a mishmash of various surfaces and so on for whatever reason. But I'm not persuaded that the LDP itself is that unclear as to what zoning is which. And I think this is not like other things that come to us in retrospect, which, as I've already said, I'm never so happy with retrospective applications. The LDP should have been known to an applicant and his advisors, given they're fairly large landowners and fairly large advisors. I think they should have known. Although I do accept their apology. I would like to have this resolved, but I don't think this is the way to do it. And on this occasion, I think this would go against. We have a major departure from the LDP and would set an unfortunate precedent. So on this occasion, I think all three of us agreed that on this occasion we cannot allow this appeal. So are you happy? You have everything you require, Mr. Elliott?
Convener, if I draw your attention to page 539 and 540, it is a unanimous decision. I haven't noted any of you to suggest any changes to the reasons for refusal. I would point out one, which is over the page 40, ground 4, policy P1B. The P's a mistake there, that should come out. It's just policy 1B. That's one I would note. Other than that, I think you're refusing in line with the appointed officer.
Yes, I think that item concluded now, colleagues. So and that is the end of today's business. Thank you once again to my two colleagues for volunteering to serve on the LRB on this occasion, and that's the meeting concluded. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.